Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how to blend acrylics using a fine mist spray bottle. Now jumping straight into this here, my first tip is to have some kind of colour on your canvas. So for this I've started with a darker green. It just makes it much easier to get some kind of initial smoother blend if we're not fighting with the white of the canvas. Now it is important that that first base layer is completely dry before we start using this second layer where I'm applying my light and darker shades. Now every now and then you're going to see that misting of water, and that's where I'm using a fine mist spray bottle just to apply that water to prevent that paint from drying out. Now my preference for applying the paint is to use some medium to large sized filberts, and I want to be making sure that I've got a variation in my lights and my darks. Now throughout this first section of this video, I'm going to do many layers here. I'm going to keep on adjusting my background until I've got the effect that I want. This is the wonderful way of working with acrylics in that we can keep on layering until we get the desired result. If we create a layer that we don't like, it just means that it's not finished. There isn't anything that we've done wrong. Now what I'm using here is a small makeup blush brush, and I sort of do little crisscross movements with this so that I've got a fairly even blend across that layer of paint. What I don't want to do is move my hand from left to right or top to bottom, because I'm more likely to create more of the streaks. As you can see here, I keep coming back and forth with this brush and I'm creating more of that softness as I do so. Now I want to have a little bit here of more of that variation, more of that patchier effect. So before I give that paint a chance to fully dry, I'm misting it with water and then applying more of the wet paint on top. Now this can cause issues if that layer underneath has started to dry. If you start to have that paint lift up and you get sort of little spots in that layer, then that means there's not enough water and that paint has started to tack up. So using that fine mist spray bottle more, and again that's going to vary depending on how fast the paint is drying where you are in the room situation and so on, that it's going to vary how much water needs to be applied. Now for this second layer I'm going to repeat the exact same process. So I'm using the water, I'm coming in with my filbert brush, and I'm trying to be a little bit more accurate with where I want my lights and darks to be. Now the real-time version of this tutorial, which if it's of interest is all linked in the description below, I've created this with a voiceover while I'm painting, so everything is explained thoroughly in the moment. I'm able to then mention why we need to be using more of the water at that time, why we're using specific techniques and so on. But here I'm really focusing on getting a variety. I don't want there to be too many larger areas of my light and dark paint. Now one thing with this technique where I'm trying to create more of that blotchy effect is that this is harder to do on this size canvas. So this is only an 8 by 10. It is small for getting this level of light and dark variation. This is certainly easier to do on a larger canvas. However, larger paintings require the more use with a fine mist spray bottle and more of those blending techniques. So working larger, if you're newer to blending acrylics, can actually make the painting process more difficult and more stressful. Which is why for this lesson, because I wanted to focus on this technique with a misting bottle, is why I've decided to keep this painting small. Now I do have plans for upcoming tutorials on a much larger scale where we'll be using these techniques and able to be getting a bit more of a smoother, softer blend with more of these light and dark variations. Now with this layer here, I'm not doing anything different in terms of the technique. I'm still using my filbert brushes. I have switched to a slightly smaller size so that I can get a little bit more accurate with those smaller patches I'm aiming for. But I'm still using my makeup brush and I'm using my fine mist spray bottle, and I'm using that whenever I feel like the paint is getting a little bit more difficult to blend. If it starts to feel like my brush is catching the surface, then I need to add a little bit more water. Now a big tip when you are using a fine mist spray bottle is not to spray it too close. You do want to have a little bit more distance, otherwise you're going to end up with a really heavy patch of water in one area. We want to be getting a little bit more of an even coverage, so I tend to hold the misting bottle about a foot and a half away. Now where I was up to this point here, I pretty much sort of thought that I was happy. I'd got that light and dark variation, and then I left it overnight, and then I came back to it the following day and thought, you know what, I need to make this significantly brighter. Now, there are many times in the painting process where I will prefer the layer before, but I've already committed to that next layer. The wonderful thing about working with acrylics is they are incredibly versatile and we can just simply paint over it. Now for this, I'm obviously using now a significantly lighter layer. So I'm starting with more of my lighter greens, more mid-tones, and I'm being a little bit more reserved with how many of those darker patches I'm adding. I did want my background to be significantly lighter than the darker values on the deer so that I could help to bring the deer closer to the foreground. Now, of course, it does mean that I'm having to spend another few minutes to get this layer in place, but it's much easier to adjust the background now rather than around the subject. So if ever you do have doubt of, is that background right? I'm not entirely sure. It's best to make those changes now before we then get the outline of the subject in. Now, one thing that I personally do experience as well is that backgrounds I find don't always look good until the subject is painted in. So if I'm not entirely sure if I need to make any changes, then I'll actually leave it, get the subject drawn in, and then I can make those changes later on, potentially, as long as it's not drastic changes. Now later on in this video, I will show how to make those changes to a background if you want to have more of those lighter or darker patches in place. And we don't have to paint over the entire painting again, and I'll show you those steps when we get to it. Now, something that can really help with a background like this is to have at least 3 values. Now, I like to have usually between 6 and 8, but having at least 3 just means then that we've got a darker value, a mid-tone and a highlight. So the background, fur, feathers, whatever it may be, everything's going to have more depth as long as we've got the right number of values. That mid-tone is just as important to help with the softness. Now this of course is something that I do explain in all of my videos, and it is going to vary depending on what we're painting. But for something like this, being able to have at least 3 values, when I come back in with my makeup brush here to blend, you can see that it blends in and then gives me another set of values. So it's always about trying to maximize the depth with any layer, and I want to be making sure that I've captured that natural variety. I don't want there, for this situation, to be too many larger areas. Now that does work with some backgrounds. If I've only got a few select light, dark and mid-tone sections and then I blend them, I'm just going to end up with a background that's more out of focus, which works for so many different situations. But here I wanted to almost hint at a bit of that clustered effect, that little bit more of the bunching up of the foliage in the background, which is why I wanted to have a bit more separation between my lights and my darks. Now a big tip here with anything regarding blending is not to overblend. Once we've mastered how to blend acrylics, it's very easy to overdo it. If that's done, then we have to wait for that layer to dry and then repeat that layer again and make sure that we stop at that point before it becomes too soft. Now on to painting the deer, and this is where I focused the real-time tutorial on how to maximise the amount of realism in an area that is very small. Now my preference here is to use smaller brushes in general. I like that for any of my paintings, but something that's as small as this, I find it much easier to still get a high level of realism with not any detail actually painted if I'm using smaller brushes. Now the smaller brushes here are enabling me to be very precise with exactly where my paint is landing. Now I know that sounds fairly obvious, but the placement of the highlights and shadows is crucial for any size, but especially when working on something that's as tiny as this. If that highlight above the eye there was just off to the left or the right slightly, it's going to change the entire shape of the face. If I'm working on a larger painting, then that's still important, but it's going to have much more of that potential to be more forgiving, because if it's only by a couple of millimeters, it's not going to be as obvious. Whereas something like this, if that highlight or a shadow is shifted just by a few millimeters, it is going to have a drastic change to the shape of the face. So this is just why I like to use smaller brushes in this situation. Now I'm still hinting at a high level of detail without that need to paint in every single hair. If I was painting in all of the hairs here, then I'm not going to have enough space. I'm going to end up painting over all of my base layers, and then my depth is going to be affected. So when working on small paintings, I like to focus more on the importance of the values and contrast rather than all of the tiny details. The face here looks like fur because I've made sure to still get my softness in place. There's no harsh edges, and I've still made sure that any indication of slight detail, I'm still following the fur direction. Now this is definitely something that is easier for me to explain in the real-time version of this tutorial. So if that is of interest, or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I will link the information to those in the description below. Now, one thing that is really important when working on an 8x10 canvas like this is it is a nice size for a head and shoulder type portrait. It's one of my favourite sizes, but when I'm painting an animal's full body like this, it's of course going to make the face much smaller. So what I want to be making sure of is that I've achieved that high level of realism that I'm aiming for, but that I'm not forcing that impression of detail because I know that the fur is there. I want to be making sure that I don't zoom into my reference photo too much, because that is more likely to make that painting process more frustrating, because I feel like I should be able to add in that detail, but I just don't have the space. Now just briefly here where I'm adjusting the background, what I'm doing is I'm actually using a little bit of water first on my canvas. So the background of course is fully dry. I'm using a brush to add some water. I'm then using another filbert brush to apply the paint, and then I'm using more of a stiffer brush to blend or soften the edges into the layer that's dry underneath. Now this technique works really well if we're not wanting to paint over the entire background. So I can be more accurate with what I want to lighten or darken, but I have to be making sure that once I come in with another layer like I am here, that the layer underneath is completely dry. If it's even just slightly tacky, this layer that I'm currently adding will basically just rework with that tacky layer underneath, and then that layer that we started with starts to lift. So I want to be making sure that as much of the blending is done, it's also important to give the right amount of drying time in between as well. Now the amount that you add here and how many changes is going to be very subjective to what you want your background to look like. There is no limit. You can keep on working this as much as what's needed. Now here there are going to be times where it's going to blend over onto the face of the deer, but because I made sure to dry the deer before I did these alterations, I could just take a brush with a little bit of water on and remove that from the deer's face before it has a chance to dry. Now in this situation, I would much rather blend over the face and end up with a bit of a foggy layer over the deer than not have that background colour go all the way up to the edge. The reason being is they'll end up with a bit of a halo around the subject, and it won't make it look like it's all been painted at the same time, which of course is what I'm going for here. I don't want that subject to look like it's been stuck on. I want it to be part of that background. Now there should be separation in terms of I want the background to look blurry and more in the distance. I want that deer to look more in focus obviously and then in the foreground. But I don't want there to be a difference around the deer itself that makes it look like I've painted the background separately. So it's really important for me that my background goes right up to the edge of the deer. So if you do end up blending over the face, the body, any of those parts, then we can lift that paint. You just want to make sure that you don't allow it to dry and just take that damp brush as I mentioned, and that works like an eraser. Now onto the body. This is where again I'm going to be using all of the same techniques that I did for the face, but because the body is larger, I've got a bit more room here to add those finer details. Now I've got lots of videos here on YouTube where I've got a range of subjects, and in every single one of them I talk about the importance of a base layer. Now for me the base layer is one of the most crucial stages of any painting. Even though I'm going to be adding many layers on top, I feel that the softness and the depth is hinted at that base layer stage. So I will spend hours if needed getting my base layer just right, because it's going to save lots of time in the long run, and I feel ends up creating more of a realistic painting when finished. Now my base layer may be 2 or 3 layers. This here, although it's a second layer of paint, I still class this as my base foundation. You'll see that my colours start to get more intense. I'm being more accurate with those placements of my highlights and shadows. And this just means that I'm not having to fight with that background colour that will in some cases show through that very first base layer of fur. So if you can see any of that background colour showing through, I always like to add another layer on top. Even though it's a rinse and repeat process, I'm not doing anything different here. I just find that it does make a real difference with the depth that's achieved in the fur. Now when it came to painting the fur, this is where I want to try to make sure that I'm still capturing the depth and detail that I want, but that again I don't overdo the detail. Although the body is much larger than the face, I still need to be making sure that I'm not forcing too much fur here because it will actually look wiry, which for this animal I need to have more of that softness coming through. Now in order to paint something to look softer, the midtones are really important. This is something that I mention in pretty much all of my videos here on YouTube. The midtones, that subtle value, is going to help make that fur look softer. If we work with our brightest highlights on top of the base layer, it's going to lose that depth and therefore the softness within the fur. Now of course this is going to vary depending on the fur texture that we are painting, and I've got lots of different tutorials here on YouTube that show a range of fur textures. More wiry coated dogs, for example, are going to have a slightly different approach, but even so I still make sure that I've got a good base foundation in first. I personally find that having harsh edges in that base layer is going to make it so much harder to create a level of realism that I like to capture in my paintings. Now when I use my rigger brushes, which is this longer bristled brush here, this works really well for more of those finer details, but again I want to be making sure that I don't add too many. With a rigger brush, it's very easy to start getting carried away and then end up creating rows or columns. The fur ends up starting to look more staged and two-dimensional. So you'll see here that every single one of these brush strokes has a curve to it, there's no straight lines. I want to be making sure that any obvious change of fur direction is captured because that is going to help with that shape and form of the animal. Now here I'm actually adding in a glaze to adjust the colour of the fur. Now glazing I speak a lot about in many other videos here. It's not something that I'm going to mention too much in this video. I will show it briefly here when I paint the grass. But I do have a video on YouTube where I'm talking through different glazes, how you can use those for different effects. So if that's of interest, I'll link that video in the description below. Now for the grass of this painting, I did want it to have a layer of outer focus effect to make it look like some of the grass was more in the distance. I'll then gradually increase the focus of that grass as I build my layers. Now for blending the grass, I'm using exactly the same techniques that I did when I worked on the background. So I add my paint, I'm then adding some water, and then I'll use my makeup brush to blend the edges. One of the main key differences here is that I'm blending a little bit more on a vertical rather than the crisscross because I don't want to overblend and lose that definition within the blades of grass. However, the blades of grass that I'm painting here are thicker, and that's because I want to still create that softness to make it look like it's a little bit fuzzy and blurry. Now this is going to vary depending on whether or not the grass in your painting needs to be more in focus, and if it does, of course, then we're going to be easing off of that fine mist spray bottle and the makeup brush. Having that balance for a painting like this really also does help to enhance the depth. Having that blurriness compared to the details, it just helps to make that deer look more in focus. Now when I want to be working with those finer details, I want to be making sure that I don't have too much paint loaded on my rigger brush. I want these blades of grass to be more delicate and intricate. If I've got more of the blob of paint on the end of that liner brush, it's going to create a significantly thicker brushstroke. One of the key aspects when working with a brush like this is not to use too much pressure. The more pressure that you apply, the thicker that line is also going to be. So those are two key important things to remember when trying to create those thinner lines. Now you'll see through here as well that once this layer of detail has dried, I'm going to then come in with a glaze and make more of the grass a bit more of a vibrant green colour. It's really important to make sure though that when you do use glazes, any of the layers underneath are completely dry. Otherwise it will mix in with that glaze and create more of a foggy look, which obviously for a glaze we want to avoid. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And if you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this deer tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I will link all of the information to that in the description below. I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.